How did the P40E Kitty Hawks of RAAF No. 75 Squadron compete against the Imperial Japanese Navy Zeros as they fought for air superiority in the skies over New Guinea? We look at their 44-day deployment to Port Moresby in March 1942.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 114 of the Principles of War podcast, No. 75 Squadron and their 44 days at Port Moresby. Last week we looked at the parlor state of the RAAF, partially at the start of the war for Australia on the 3rd of September 1939 when Robert Menzies declared war on Germany, but more importantly, the start of when the war came to Australia with Japan's lightning advance south that took them all the way to New Guinea. The difficulties experienced in early 1942 by the RAAF and the Army are very different as they struggle to generate combat power in defence of the nation. However, if you listen very carefully for the issues with the RAAF, you will hear the same leitmotif that we have heard in the previous 15 episodes as we've looked at the 53rd Battalion and how they were thwarted in their ability to operate tactically by mistakes made at the operational and strategic level. I don't want to let the cat out of the bag just at the moment about the issues at the strategic level, but I want to read a short quote from Albert Palazzo. He wrote, "The Air Force was in a particularly dire state, and it was no great exaggeration when an RAAF senior officer observed in February 1942 that the Air Force had hardly a feather to fly with." Just to orientate you to time and space, the 3rd of February 1942, we get the first raid on Port Moresby, and on the 19th of February 1942, we see the first raid on Darwin. And as I said, that raid was exactly 900 days after Menzies declared war in 1939. That came from his chapter in Australia 1942, In the Shadow of War. This was edited by Peter Dean. This has been my go-to book when we look at issues operationally and strategically. It has a wide range of essays by experts in their area, which clearly lays out the problems that we saw at that level of war. And I just want to continue, and I want to read another paragraph out of Albert's chapter in that book. The chapter is called The Overlooked Mission, Australia and Home Defence. There's something fundamentally wrong when you overlook the mission of home defence, because that would be the primary mission of a defence force, one would have thought. In the paragraph he writes, "Japan's actions in 1941 confirmed that there was nothing wrong with the rationality of Australia's national security policy and the objectivity of those responsible for its determination. Its designers had correctly deduced that Japanese militarism posed a real threat to the nation's welfare. What is at issue, however, is that the linkage between the government's risk assessment process and the design and implementation of a national security strategy by which to offset the danger Japan posed to the nation's security. In determining national security policy, it is vital not only to determine the risks correctly, but also to provide for appropriate mitigations of these if the process is to have legitimacy." I dare say that this podcast series will come back and have a look at that key phrase there, probably over multiple episodes, because it is so important for the conduct of operations in defence of the nation. For today, we're going to look at the tactical employment of air power in Port Moresby in 1942. No. 75 Squadron is formed on the 4th of February 1942. That is one day after the first bombing raid on Port Moresby. The Japanese are in the process of establishing air supremacy over Port Moresby and pretty much most of New Guinea. There's very little that can be done to defend Port Moresby or indeed the rest of New Guinea, given the fact that the RAAF only has a handful of Catalina flying boats with which to defend the airspace. In late February, Australia received 75 P40E Kitty Hawks from the United States. These were originally destined for Java, but the war was going so badly that they'd been rerouted to Australia. This was very lucky for the RAAF because it actually gave them some fighter aircraft. It was decided to raise 3 squadrons in defence of Australia. These would be 75, 76 and 77 squadrons. 75 Squadron would have 16 officers, 186 airmen, and 28 of those would be pilots. Of the 28 pilots, only 4 had operational experience. They were Peter Turnbull, he would go on to be the squadron leader for 76 Squadron, Dave Ellerton, John Jackson, who would take over as squadron leader from the inaugural commanding officer, which was Wing Commander Peter Jeffrey. Turnbull, Jackson and Jeffrey had all been flying P40Es in the Middle East in the Desert Air Force. Some of the other pilots were experienced pilots, some of them not so much. Jeffrey had been summoned to the Air Board to receive his orders for the formation of 75 Squadron. He complained about the level of experience of many of the pilots, but he was assured that all of them were experienced flying instructors, which was a complete lie. Some had only just qualified as pilots. Ideally, Jeffrey would have been given 100 hours for each of his pilots to meld them into a squadron and, in particular, get those who haven't flown the Kitty Hawk familiar with the aircraft. He would get nowhere near that time. And this was going to have a huge impact on the squadron. 75 Squadron was to get 25 of the 75 Kitty Hawks that were available, and these were in Sydney. They needed to be ferried up to Townsville. That flight occurred on the 7th of March. Let's have a listen to Arthur Tucker. He's one of the pilots who will be doing the ferry flight. He's being interviewed by Edward Stokes for the War Memorial.
There was a flight when Jeffries came down south and you all headed off north, and there was a real debacle. How do you recall that episode beginning? When did you meet Jeffries?
I met him on the morning of the 7th at Bankstown. I see he had been attached to Squadron Headquarters Bankstown, but I'd never met him at that stage. Incidentally, he hadn't been north at that stage. He was coming over from Perth or something. There'd been a small group of us, half a dozen, attached to the 7th Pursuit at Bankstown. There'd been another half dozen at Williamtown and another half dozen at Canberra, all attached to where they were forming US Air Corps squadrons. And suddenly, 10 of us, including the new leader, were told off to proceed to Townsville. We'd never met most of those who were flying. I think there were 2 or 3 of us from Bankstown, or maybe even less. Connor, Norton and I, and maybe I think that's about all. All the others were strangers to us. And we'd only flown the aeroplane 4 times, never in formation. And of course we hadn't done the instrument flying in it. At that stage, we didn't have any radios because we didn't have microphones or earpieces that would fit the aeroplane. We didn't have any oxygen, so we couldn't communicate with one another, and we couldn't fly theoretically above about 16,000 feet. We took off and circled round and round for quite a while because somebody couldn't get his engine started. We'd said to the leader that we'd never flown formation, and he said, "Well, that's all right, I won't take you into cloud." And we set off eventually. The leader had 3 aircraft formating on him. I was flying in the starboard flight, led by Norton, with Connor on his starboard. I was on his port, that's on the left-hand side. And then on the far left, Johnny Piper had Holiday and someone else with him. So that meant in a formation, if you're formating on a section leader, you depend on him then to keep your flight orientated with the rest of the squadron. He's got to be watching the leader and his people. Well, we didn't get far beyond the Hawkesbury, and we started getting into the lower bits of the cloud, which were getting lower and lower. And suddenly, we were in cloud, and when you're cloud flying or blind flying, the difficulty is to believe your instruments and not your feelings. Nevertheless, you do get a feeling that things aren't quite right. And when I looked, after all, you get in tight and you're formating on your leader and you're trusting him in every way. That means you don't look in the office. When I did, our speed was up and we were in a tight, obviously descending spiral to the right. Now, we had no wireless, nothing at all, and obviously there was nothing I could do for him, but the time had come to bail out, metaphorically. So I straightened up on my bat and ball, which was no problem to me with the training I'd had with Jeff Ball. So I could see a little aeroplane way ahead of me, so I thought company had been nice, and I chased off after him. And after a period of probably half an hour, 25 minutes, half an hour, I was nearly up to him, and suddenly he dived down. When I got there was a lovely big, you often see these, sort of a round opening slanting down. I could see the sea underneath and him just at the bottom, so I shot down after him. And there was heavy, we were down along the coast, up the north coast. There was heavy rain in there. And once again, when I was within perhaps a quarter of a mile of him, I saw him put his wheels down and his flaps, turn left, and then head off into a heavy rain. So I thought he looked like somebody who knew what he was doing. I might as well follow him. Came in, wheels and flaps down, over the edge of an aerodrome. And the rain was so heavy, I saw the end of the runway, and I was about halfway through my landing run, and suddenly hangars shot past on the left-hand side, and we were at Evans Head, and it was Johnny Piper I'd followed there. Later, I discovered that Norton, the fellow who'd been leading me, was killed at Kempsey. Holiday, who'd been with Piper, was killed up near Port Macquarie. Connor, who was the third one of our Vic, got himself down along the coast and tried to land at Kyogle. He got out of it, but he wrecked the aeroplane.
Here we see, once again, the Japanese reaping the reward of their strategic surprise and tempo. Despite thousands of pilots being trained for the Empire Air Training Scheme, there are insufficient fully trained pilots available to equip even one squadron. These pilots haven't been trained for combat, and yet they're going to be facing extremely well-trained pilots from Japan who will be flying very capable aircraft. Not only haven't they been trained for combat, they haven't even been trained to fly in cloud. These pilots haven't been set up for success, but there's no time to do that. Port Moresby had been bombed on the 3rd of February for the first time, and the first bombing of Darwin occurred on the 19th of February. These accidents had occurred on the 7th of March. Not only have 2 pilots been killed, but 3 of the aircraft have been wrecked. That is over 10% of the squadron's strength. And they're not even in Port Moresby yet. The effect that this is having in Port Moresby is dire. After the first bombing raid, there was looting. Many of the local inhabitants had left and returned to their villages. They had been providing labour for the local administration in Port Moresby. That work would now either not be done or would have to be done by the troops of 39th, 49th and 53rd Battalion, giving them even less time to train. Just as we saw with the troops when they were on Kokoda, the impact on morale when they were receiving indirect fire from Japanese artillery and were unable to respond, we're seeing a similar impact on morale with the bombings on Port Moresby, where there is no ability for the Australians to respond. Once the squadron concentrated in Townsville, they were given just 9 days for pilot training. Arthur Tucker, who we heard from earlier, said that he only had 3 flights in the P40 during that period, and that was just formation flying around in a V formation. John Pettit, one of the other pilots, wrote, "In Townsville, I had 6 days training. In fact, it wasn't really training at all, just getting used to the aeroplane and getting used to the other people and flying around as a squadron." Michael Butler, one of the other pilots, wrote about the conversion course that they did. I would think our conversion course onto Kitty Hawks from Wirraways would be the shortest possible. I don't think that they could have made it any shorter. I think it averaged 8 hours. We did a little bit of formation flying, no gunnery at all, and certainly no tactics. When we were going up to Port Moresby, the leader of the flight said, "When you take off from Horn Island, I suggest you try your guns because you might need them when we get to Moresby." I gave it a short burst, and that was just like the heavens being let loose. So disturbingly, that is the first time that this pilot has actually used his guns. John Pettit wrote about his experience firing the guns. "I fired 4 guns at one time, only once on shadow firing, but the first time I used the whole 6 guns was against a 0. He estimated that he'd flown a Kitty Hawk for a total sum of 12 hours and 50 minutes, which included the ferry flight from Townsville to Port Moresby. Squadron Leader Peter Turnbull wrote to Northeast Area Command, "On the whole, the standard of flying in 75 Squadron was high, but signs of underconfidence showed up in the pilots with less than 100 hours on the Wirraway type of aircraft. This would not have occurred had the pilots been allowed time for training. They were not up to operational standard." He assessed that there were 10 pilots who had less than 10 hours flying time on the Kitty Hawk. This had a psychological impact on the pilots as well. Tucker wrote, "There was a tremendous defeatism everywhere. No one was confident that the Japanese could be defeated at this stage of the war, and these men from the Middle East didn't have too much faith in what they'd be able to do either. You have to remember that the Japanese were undefeated. They'd swept all before them, and we would be facing their very top men. The 3 Squadron blokes hadn't come up against anything like that." The pilots from 3 Squadron that he was talking about were John Jackson, Peter Jeffrey, Peter Turnbull, and Dave Ellerton. They were the only ones with operational experience. The flying experience for the pilots from 3 Squadron would be significantly different from what they had seen in North Africa, because the Japanese in New Guinea had one main target, and that was Port Moresby, and that was where 75 Squadron was going to be flying out of. On the 17th of March, 33 ground crew and staff officers boarded a Qantas Empire flying boat, which flew them to Port Moresby. The arrival of 75 Squadron was getting close, and there were high expectations from the troops in Port Moresby. On the 20th of March, 4 fighters appeared over 7 Mile Drone, and there was much rejoicing. However, that stopped once the fighters started strafing the airfield, and it was realised they were Japanese fighters. The next day, the 21st, a flight of another 4 fighters is seen over the airfield. These aircraft, sporting an unfamiliar engine noise and the red, white and blue roundels of the RAAF, are correctly identified by the soldiers of the 67th Anti-Aircraft Searchlight Battery as the first flight of 75 Squadron. However, the soldiers of the 39th Battalion around the airfield are not quite sure. They see the centre of the roundel being red and mistake that for the rising sun of the Japanese. One Lewis gunner opens fire, and he is followed by others. This is despite the fact that the aircraft are approaching with gear and flaps down because they are about to land. All of the aircraft are hit, but none of the pilots are injured. However, on landing, Peter Jeffrey discovers a bullet hole in his headrest. The bullet had missed the back of his skull by a mere inch. He promptly gets out of his aircraft, pulls his .38 revolver and starts looking for the culprit. He does eventually calm down. Here we see a friendly fire incident between services. A breakdown in communication, jittery gunners who the previous day had mistaken Japanese fighters for the incoming flight, and a lack of agreed procedures led to an incident that saw one of the aircraft so badly damaged that it would never fly again. Over the preceding 43 days, since the Japanese had started raiding Port Moresby, there had been 16 raids. 2 of the aircraft were able to be quickly repaired, which was fortuitous because at 3:53, number 75 Squadron RAAF would have their first scramble. Gunner Raymond Neal, who was serving in the Paga Coastal Defence Battery at Port Moresby, takes up the story. A typical tropical afternoon with about 60 to 70% cloud cover. We observers were watching for the appearance of the Jap bomber between cloud breaks and trying to track his location by the sound of his engines. Imagine our delight to hear our fighters come onto the scene. Troops came out from cover on every hill and ridge and were screaming directions to our fighter pilots whenever the enemy aircraft appeared in a clear patch of sky. Unheard, of course, but a reflection of the long months of not being able to deal with an enemy aircraft outside the range of anti-aircraft guns. I stood on Pagga Hill outside the battery observation post and watched the battle between our new fighters and the frantically manoeuvring Jap bomber. A break came in the cloud, and there the bomber was, my binoculars up and in time to see the final attack by our fighters. A bright burst of fire inside the aircraft, then a rapidly developing conflagration, and one Jap bomber falling in a screaming, uncontrolled dive to make a large splash in the sea beyond the reef outside Moresby Harbour. On every hill and ridge around the shores of Moresby, assembled spectator troops cheered this first victory over one of those that had been harassing us for months. The two pilots in that mission were Barry Cox and Wilbur Wackett. Wilbur was the son of Sir Lawrence Wackett. During the war, he presided over the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation and was one of the most influential aircraft designers in Australia. And so began the 44 days at Port Moresby for 75 Squadron. The new commander, Squadron Leader John Jackson, was keen to maintain the momentum. The Japanese bomber that had been shot down had been conducting a reconnaissance mission on the Port Moresby airfield. The Japanese were expecting the arrival of 75 Squadron at some time. 2 hours before its arrival, two Hudsons of No. 32 Squadron had taken off on their own photo reconnaissance mission to the airfield at Lae. When Jackson examined the photos that the Hudsons had taken, he couldn't believe his eyes. The Japanese aircraft were parked wingtip to wingtip on either side of the runway, bombers on one side, fighters on the other. There was still a chance that the Japanese were unaware of the arrival of 75 Squadron. Whilst Cox and Wackett had been conducting their interception, leading aircraftman Ron Petrich had been instructed to hold down the Morse key in an attempt to jam their communications. The next morning, the 10 Kitty Hawks that had arrived were lined up for takeoff. They were divided into two flights, one under John Jackson, which would attack the aircraft before they were able to take off. The other 5 would provide top cover. One of the aircraft in that flight crashed on takeoff, and the pilot was pulled from the aircraft unconscious before it caught fire. The remaining 4 continued on with the mission. The 2 flights crossed the Owen Stanley Ranges. Jackson planned to bring them in from the east over the water with the rising sun at their backs. It was expected that the Japanese would have their own combat air patrol and that there would be anti-aircraft gunners around the field. As they closed on the runway, they could see that the aircraft had not moved from the previous day's photo reconnaissance images. 2 aircraft attacked the fighters and 3 aircraft attacked the bombers. The first pass went well, with only light anti-aircraft fire and no sign of the Japanese combat air patrol. Jackson decided to chance his luck and make another pass at the runway. After the second pass, Flying Officer Bruce Anderson's Kitty Hawk was hit as it turned into approaching zeros. Peter Turnbull noticed one of our aircraft to be out of control and turn over on its side and dive downwards with smoke streaming from it towards a hill near Lae. The aircraft appeared to be definitely out of control and was lagging behind the other 4 aircraft that had done the ground strafing. On the second pass, Flight Lieutenant John Piper flew so low that the propeller from one of the Japanese aircraft hit his plane, ripping a Browning machine gun out of it and nearly ripping the wing off. Here we see one big difference between the P40 and the Zero, and that is the robustness of the airframe in the P40. It was a heavy airframe able to absorb a large amount of damage. Turnbull's combat air patrol flight had initially missed the Japanese Dawn Patrol. However, once he spotted it, he nosed over and led his planes into the melee. They were soon engaged with the Zeros. Wilbur Wackett managed one short burst against a Zero. He discovered to his horror that he only had one machine gun functioning. He did see Tracer, though, hit the port wing of the Zero. However, what he didn't realise was that he was about to be attacked by a second Zero. His aircraft was hit and started streaming black smoke. He quickly made an appreciation that it was best to head for cloud and get as far away from the airfield as possible. With unknown damage to the airframe, he decided that it would be much better to ditch the aircraft. The large air scoop under the nose makes the P-40 a difficult aircraft to ditch. Wackett managed to survive the ditching at 90 knots and he quickly egressed the rapidly sinking aircraft. Wackett's adventure was only just beginning though, because as he got into the water, a large shark surfaced just a few feet away from him. He wrote, "My heart skipped a beat as I saw it, and I looked at the land which seemed 10 miles off. I started swimming. After a few strokes, I stopped to unroll my sleeves and pull my socks up over my knees, as I thought this would make me less noticeable to the sharks, and wondered whether I should discard my revolver and water bottle as they weighed me down. I decided to leave them on as I was swimming into Japanese-held territory and might need them." Wackett swam for 9 hours through shark-infested waters. When he finally got to the beach, the villagers nearby feared him because of reprisals from the Japanese if they assisted. But 2 young boys offered to be his guide. The trio walked for 5 days, gaining 10,000 feet in altitude, before they met up with a New Guinea Volunteer Rifles detachment. The 2 guides were given the princely sum of 20 shillings each as a reward for safely escorting Wackett. This had been a deliberate ploy by the NGVR soldiers to encourage the locals to support Allied troops wherever possible. It would take Wilbur Wackett an entire month to get back to 75 Squadron. Back at Port Moresby, Jackson reflected on the events of the day and the results from the mission. 75 Squadron claimed 12 destroyed on the ground and 2 in the air. The Japanese recorded no air combat losses, however 6 destroyed on the ground and 8 damaged, 7 of which couldn't be repaired with the facilities that they had at Lae. Jackson had lost 2 aircraft in combat and another 3 aircraft had been lost to airfield accidents. This represented 20% of his original strength and this was clearly unsustainable. The RAAF would be in for a tough fight with the element of surprise now gone. The day after the raid, the Japanese returned and attacked Port Moresby. The little warning time combined with the slow climb speed of the Kitty Hawk meant that the Japanese were dropping bombs on Port Moresby at 20,000 feet whilst the P40Es were still climbing through 7,000 feet. Meanwhile, strafing Zeros had destroyed 2 P40Es that had become bogged and they lost 1 aircraft of their own to anti-aircraft fire. On the 23rd of March, only 3 days into the deployment, Peter Jeffrey, one of the most experienced pilots within 75 Squadron, would return to Australia. He was going to assist with the establishment of 76 and 77 Squadrons, the 2 other Kitty Hawk squadrons. Of the 25 Kitty Hawks that had been available for the formation of the squadron, only 17 had come across because of losses from accidents. In the first 3 days, 7 had been destroyed, leaving only 10 available Kitty Hawks. The War Office in Melbourne was obviously concerned about the casualty rate and it issued permission to the Northeastern Area Headquarters to withdraw 75 Squadron to Horn Island if required. This they delegated down to Jackson, being the officer on the ground. Jackson had seen the great morale boost that the Kitty Hawks had given to the troops in Port Moresby. He discussed the decision with Group Captain Charles Pearce, the commanding officer in Port Moresby. It was Pearce who said that if the Air Force was to leave, the Army would have to swim home. Jackson resolved to stay and fight it out in Port Moresby. To see how the remaining 41 days of 75 Squadron's deployment to Port Moresby goes, we're going to have to come back for the next episode. There, we're going to look at the doctrinal development for combat between the P40 and the Zero, and we're going to look at the Jackson brothers, both Les and John. We're going to delve into the fascinating differences in leadership styles between the 2 brothers. If you've liked this episode, then please write a review on your favourite podcast player and reach out and let me know how you're using the Principles of War podcast in your PME program.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.